Hi, this is my workplace communication problem, and my problem is related to new equipment being purchased for the data center and not being approved or reviewed prior to that purchase. Thanks. My workplace problem has four parts. First part is that departments are purchasing IT equipment that is not well suited for the corporate data centers. The second part is that the data center team, which is the team I am on, is not being consulted prior to these purchases. Also, the departments are not sharing plans with the other departments, so people don't really talk, and the silos are keeping us from knowing what each department is buying. And then lastly, these decisions aren't going through an architectural standards review before they are purchasing that equipment, and it's typically being purchased from the bottom end at the engineer level, and the architects don't know about it and can't really plan for it or make sure that it fits into what they want the model of the data center to be. Now, let me further explain these problems so that makes a little bit more sense to you. So first, as far as this hardware not going through approvals or review before purchase, sometimes it's not following some very basic standards that we would do in the data center to make things run more efficiently and more reliably. So the first one that is the easiest one to tackle is that people are buying devices that don't have redundant power supplies. And if you look at the two images at the top of this PowerPoint, you'll see what I'm talking about. So the picture here on the right only has a single power supply on it. And when you see that red X there, that means if the power gets cut there somewhere along that path above stream, that device is going to go offline. Or if that power supply in the device breaks, that device is going to go offline. That can then cause clinical downtimes and be a real issue for the hospital. What's much more reliable is the server on the left of that with the blue and red lines there, where you can see I have the red X on the blue line, and that means that if the blue power gets cut, the red power can take over and the server has no interruptions and no issues, and we can go check out why did the blue power lose its connection on that server. So that would be one of our very first things that we would look at with the equipment. Does it have dual power supplies? Another thing that we would often look at is, does the cooling platform support where our data centers are set up to cool? And when I say that, most devices accept the cooling on the front of it. That cool air then passes through that device. You can see those arrows there on the device on the left getting more red as they go across the chips inside that server. And then at the very end, they get rejected at a hotter temperature. Now, if you have a piece of equipment that is not accepting cold air through the front, we're going to have difficulty getting cold air to it, because that's how our rows in the data center is set up to provide cool air to the front of the equipment. So if instead it wants cool air on the back of it or on the side of it, it can make it very difficult to provide that cold air to it. And secondarily with that, it can also reject hot air into the aisle that we're pumping full of air conditioning. That's incredibly inefficient and can cause recirculation of hot air. So that'll be something that we really push, is that it has the correct airflow when they buy that equipment. Now, with the standards, there is not really a standard of what hardware devices should be before they are purchased. Instead, people are just buying whatever the vendor recommends to them. So what I want to do is create a document that will have standards that they can then follow. And then lastly here, departments are not communicating their plans to each other. So one department has no idea what another department is doing. And that doesn't sound that big of a deal, but when you think about it, that an application needs to run over the server team, and that needs to be stored on the storage team, and that needs to be connected through the network team. And if these teams aren't talking together, that can cause issues with compatibility or with just planning your purchases. So my proposed solution is really a four-part solution. The first one, and really the easiest part of this, is to create an approved hardware architecture guide. And my desired outcome for this is to have a guide that goes into cooling, power, and layout, and then in each one of those sections it has a subsection for servers, for routers, for switches, for storage. And each one of those can be personalized to those specific technologies because there are some differences between those. So secondarily with that, I brought this idea up with my director because this has been an ongoing issue, and he's actually worked this up the chain to his senior director, and we're looking at creating a hardware architecture review board. And what that would mean is that would be a team of architects and data center people or other people in the IT industry where they would be responsible with reviewing anytime somebody got a new piece of hardware that hasn't been something that's been reviewed in the past. So that may be a new application, or it could be an existing application that's being moved to a new hardware platform or a new version of an existing hardware. So that hardware architecture review board will use my guide to review that hardware. So it's kind of a secondary action to the guide there. And then we will mandate that any new hardware purchases will go through that review board. And that is why we've gotten the senior director involved, because he's the director over all these groups. And we need that managerial push to make sure that people go through this process. And lastly, as I said, the board will use my architecture guide to evaluate new hardware. So instead of just looking at the hardware when people ask, is this okay, and blindly just looking through it and seeing if it works, they'll have a guide where they can look at it and go, that doesn't really follow our standard. And then they can go back to the vendor and say, hey, this doesn't meet our architecture guide, here's what we would like instead. And it'll give us more of an ability to push back. Instead of saying we don't like that, we can say it doesn't fit our architecture guide. So this is my proposed solution to the problem, and I will update you guys as I develop this further. And I plan on getting my hardware architecture guide done in the next week or two, because my boss actually has specifically asked, now that I brought it up, when I can get that created so that we can have something when we look at creating this hardware architecture review board. Thank you for your time.